Hi everybody, welcome back to .NET on Azure, the Beginner Series. My name is Matt Sokup, and in this episode we're going to be talking about continuous integration and delivery, or CI/CD, with GitHub Actions. So let's take a second to talk about what GitHub Actions are. It's a CI/CD platform. Now imagine that, we're going to be talking about a CI/CD platform in a video titled CI/CD. It's integrated with your GitHub repository, which is super cool, in that you can actually create a file, put it in your GitHub repo, and see the CI/CD pipeline run from GitHub's website. Now, the GitHub Actions are organized into workflows. Now, these workflows can do different things. The most common one is that they're going to build and deploy your application, but they can do many different things. Now, these actions are going to kick off and run based on events. Now, some of the events could be a push to your repository, or maybe a new issue is opened on your repository as well, or a pull request is received. So GitHub Actions can get kicked off and run based off of events, and the events can vary. And I'm sorry about this, but the GitHub Action workflow is going to be defined in a YAML file. So you have to get your spacing right, but once you get that down, it's actually really cool, all the power that you do get with the GitHub Action workflow. All right, so there's several components that go into a workflow, and it's useful to understand what everything is, and once you do, everything kind of fits right together. So the first off is the overall workflow, and it's the overall process that runs when the action gets kicked off. Now, you can have more than one workflow per repository, which is great. And the workflow itself executes on a runner or a server. Now, the server could be Windows, it could be Ubuntu Linux, or it could even be Mac OS. So the execution context is running on a server, and you have the differences amongst that. And then you have events. Events are what's going to kick off that workflow. And like I mentioned before, there are many different types of events that you could have. And then you have a job. You can almost kind of think of a job like a folder for steps that's going to run to execute within that workflow. So it's a grouping of various different steps. And then what are the steps? Those are finally the actions of GitHub Actions. Now, actions themselves are built-in tasks that perform a complex task. Now, a complex task might actually be setting up .NET on GitHub Actions, because the overall workflow is a clean virtual machine. So you're going to have to set up .NET on that. Or if you want to deploy to Azure, that's pretty complex. Logging in and then deploying up to Azure like an app service, that's pretty complex. But that's an action. But you could also run a script. So let's say you wanted to do .NET Run. You could also do that. That's not necessarily an action, but in my head I kind of think of it that way. So you have actions, you have scripts, organized into jobs that get kicked off by events, and the whole thing is a workflow, as shown here. The big white rectangle in the back, the overall is the workflow, gets kicked off by events, and then you have the runners working. Each job is a series of steps. The steps can either be an action or a script that go. So that, in a nutshell, there's a whole bunch more to it, but really that's all you need to understand when we start getting started with GitHub Actions. So let's actually jump in and create our own GitHub Action to deploy the Munson Pickles web and API. Here's a neat thing. I have the Munson Pickles web solution open. So I don't have the API open here, just have the web. I can actually go through, right-click, and publish. Click Azure, next, App Service for Windows, and I see my subscription pop up, and it gives me a couple resource groups where I have app services already defined in. I'll pick the one that I want to deploy to, which will be Munson East US Dev, the web portion. Hit Next, and right here, it gives me instead of publishing, it gives me the opportunity to actually create a CI/CD workflow using GitHub Actions. Now, if I would do this, it would go out and create the YAML file for me. The YAML file will be populated with a .NET restore to get all the NuGet packages down. It would be populated with a build, and it would have the test, it would have the publish in there, all .NET commands. And then it would actually also have the GitHub Actions to deploy to Azure. And it would create a secret in GitHub to have the credentials that I can do it all. I am going to skip this process so we can write it by hand and you can see how it all works. Trust me to say, though, this would work for you and you have a head start, but let's do it by hand so you can actually see it all work. So I'll cancel out of here. I will minimize Visual Studio, and I'm going to open up VS Code just to keep things separated so we can know what we're working on. All right, I have the same solution opened with my projects, the .api, the .functions, and .web. So when you create a GitHub Action workflow, it actually, in order for GitHub to pick it up on the website and run it, it has to belong in a certain file structure. And the first portion of it is .github. And then the second portion of that is a folder called workflows. So once you put, then you can put any YAML in there, and that YAML file then will get picked up by GitHub when you do a push, and the workflow will be available to run as an action. So let's create it, and we're just going to call this deploy API.yml. Great. So now we have our GitHub Action workflow. Let's see. GitHub Action to deploy Munson Pickles API to Azure. Why not? Save that. And so our first steps that we want to do is give it a name. We'll give it that name that is suggested by us. And then it gives you, we are getting prompted by Copilot on certain things to do. So what I'm actually going to say is the triggers here on, and I'm going to say workflow dispatch instead of the like a push or a pull request. And what workflow dispatch gives me is the ability to just run it manually. So I'm going to skip the other portions for now on the push or anything like that, and just say, you know what, I only want this to run when I personally go onto the website and kick it off. And so then the next step is I'm going to say a jobs. So now, if you remember, a jobs is a way to do steps. And so my first job is to build it. I want to build my application. And so I'm going to say runs on Ubuntu latest. So specifying which virtual machine type I want it to run on. And the virtual machines are built new every single time. And then the next thing is specifying the steps of essentially the workflow to run. And first is using actions. So using actions checkout, I'm going to say v3 for the latest version of the checkout actions, and then giving it a name. Making sure I get my spacing correct because I don't want that to blow up on me. So the first step is to use actions, v3, so it's going to pull my code, check it out. And then I'm going to set up .NET Core, and I'm going to give it a name. And then say setting it up, and setting up .NET Core can be v3 as well. And then I'm going to say the .NET version 7.0.x, because that's what we're using here. And so my next step is to install the dependencies or a NuGet restore. So it's going to say run .NET to store, .NET restore. Now because the GitHub Action is going to be running at a level above all of my projects here, I'm going to have to say, you know what, run the Munson Pickles API. And then after that, I'm going to set a new step, give it a name, we'll call it build. And then it's going to be run .NET build Munson Pickles API configuration release no restore. Great. So actually, let's save that and then check that in, deploy API. new GitHub action, and then we will commit and push that staged file. All right, so we're going to go out here to our repo, refresh it, and I see I now have .github.workflows and the deploy API there. So if I look in the Actions tab, I now have this action. It's deploy Munts and Pickles API, the same name that I gave it. If I click on that, I can see I can start it up with a workflow dispatch trigger. And I can say, you know what, let's run it on the main branch. So I click Run, and it requests a runner for me to go. So once that gets a runner, so it's going out and saying, hey, GitHub, give me a machine that I can run this on. I have it here. You can see it's queued, it's in progress. I can click on it to see what's actually going on. So I must have got my YAML right because it's not blowing up with incorrect YAML formatting. So it's setting up .NET Core, install the dependencies, building it all, and looks like it's finished. And I can go through and check out, yep, I have my warnings because I didn't check my null references. And down here, post actions from the checkout and jobs completed. So everything ran. Everything ran great. I have my green arrow. Awesome. So let's continue on building our YAML file for our actions. So the next thing that we're going to want to do then, as you can imagine, is that we want to go create a publish file now that we've built it. And I'm going to do just publish, call it name publish, and I say .NET publish, .Munts and Pickles API, configuration release, and then we're going to where to push it, output.publish. You know what, I'm going to build it just to be happy. And then next up, we're going to actually want to go through and deploy. And before I do that, I want to set up the deployment profile or the deployment credentials that GitHub can use in order to connect to Azure and deploy things with. So the way I do this is I have to go out to Azure, and I'm going to be deploying to app Munts and API EastUS Dev 001. And you can see right here there's a download publish profile. So this is an XML file that gives me the ability to publish. So I'm going to download it. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to open it in a notepad. And it's just a bunch of XML. So I'm going to select everything, copy it, and then jump back over to GitHub. And what I want to do is go to settings and create a secret for my repository. So down in security, there's secrets and variables. Underneath actions, I can do a new repository secret. So I'm going to call this API publish secret. Paste that in there. So now anytime I refer to API publish secret in my GitHub action, I will get this secret here, which allows me to go and publish it then, which is great. So I'll add the secret. Once it's there, we're good to go. See, if I try to edit it, I can't see it. I can only add to it. I can't see the existing one, which is awesome. So it's safe. Safe from even me, and I added it. So API publish secret is its name. So the next thing I want to do is actually add an environment variable to the workflow. env. And what I'm going to say is here, Azure Web App Name. And so what this is going to allow me to do is get the app name so when I actually publish to Azure. And so that's going to be this. just paste that in. So now we're going to see how to both refer to a secret in GitHub and a variable in the file. And now I can actually go down and deploy it. So for my deploy to Azure, I'll let this Copilot tell me what I want to do. So I'm going to say deploy to Azure. It's going to use the web apps deploy action, and it's going to use the environment variable Azure web app name, which hopefully is the same as we put up here, Azure web app name. And then the publish profile is secrets value, and I want to change that to whatever I put into the action secret, API publish profile. So I need to change that. API publish profile. And the package is going to reside in the publish directory, which is where we're putting it from the output from our .NET publish. That should be all we need to do in order to deploy to Azure. So saving everything, we can go back and stage, deploy to Azure, commit and push. Alrighty, and then now I'll go back to my GitHub Actions in GitHub. And now let's run this again. And so it's been requested, the workflow run was requested, and eventually I can see that it's been queued, and I'll just go in here and watch it eventually start running. So this will take maybe a couple minutes of actually being pushed up to Azure itself. So in the publish profile, all that XML, it has all the information needed, including the web address of the app service of where I want to put it. So now we're publishing, deploying to Azure. So I'll open, this part takes just a tad to run, obviously. It looks like, oh, we did get a problem. And what is it? No credentials found. Azure login action before this action. All right, let's see. All right, so it's entirely possible we did not put a correct publish profile in. So let's reset our publish profile. Download it again, open it up. It's all selected. Copy it. We're going to go back out to GitHub and make sure we put it into our settings. Security, security and variables, actions. We'll edit our repository secret. It's all there. We should be good to go. We have a username, we have a password. There's no reason why we shouldn't be good. All right, we'll update the secret. Have to get a configuration key. Verified, updated. So let's make sure API publish secret. Back to the GitHub action. All right, it possibly wasn't the right value before. API publish profile. There we go. API publish secret. That was our issue. And now we will add it, fix typo, and then commit and push. So the issue that we had was I mistyped our secret name. Okay, so we're good to go. I will jump back out to the actions, then run the workflow one last time. Base it off the main branch. It's been requested, and soon we'll see a new row pop up here. Jump into the build. and it should work this time. And sometimes it does take a while based on how long other things are running on GitHub. So as you can see, this setup job is taking a little bit longer than it has before. But it has other information for me, such as I can go through and actually view the workflow file itself. So I can scroll down here and I can see that API published secret. So it is using the correct workflow file that we just went up. And I can see that I'm using the build job and any billable time that I might have and the runtime as well. So let's go back and see that we're running. Great, now we're deploying to Azure currently. So let's see if this actually goes through. It looks like we got the check mark, so we're good. And it should green check mark now. So if I go over to the Munson API East US, scroll down to Deployment Center, refresh it, I will get a new time based off of it, and it looks good to me. So we have our GitHub action all set up. As soon as we have the variable names right, it deploys like a charm. And looking back at it, make sure you put it into a .github folder, a workflows folder, .github/workflows, and then there's various actions involved. The first action is to check out the files. The second is to make sure we set up .NET using version 7. And then we're running scripts such as .NET Restore, pointing it at the correct CSproj file, .NET Build, then .NET Publish, and then finally another action called Web Apps Deploy, which is an Azure action, and then making sure we give it the right app name, and then the publish secret, and then where to grab the file from. All right, so that's CI/CD with GitHub Actions. It's built into your code's GitHub repo. And we looked at a little bit about what workflows are, what the runners are, the server that it runs on, essentially, what events are, what kicks off the action itself, what the jobs are, or grouping of set of actions, and the actions themselves, which can be built-in actions provided by GitHub, or the one that we saw provided by Azure, which deployed it, or actual scripts that you run, such as the .NET Build script. An event starts the workflow, such as workflow dispatch when we started it ourselves, or a push to a repo, or a new issue could do it as well. Actions themselves, the ones that are not scripts, are complex tasks, such as setting up .NET, or checking out, or pushing up to Azure. Complex tasks. Scripts are a little bit easier, just running .NET. And everything is defined in YAML, so you have to watch your spaces. All right, so that's been GitHub Actions, showing off a CI/CD pipeline, call the workflow with it. And overall, that's been the beginner series for .NET on Azure. I hope you enjoyed it. My name is Matt Sokup. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me at CodeMailMatt on Twitter or matt.sokup@microsoft.com for email. Thanks a lot.